over, I'll turn it over to Kathy Cahill, the Associate Dean of Accessibility and User Experience.
Thanks, Catherine. Hi, everyone. I'm glad you could join us today for this, this talk on working with vendors around accessibility issues. So I'm joined by a member of my team, Catherine Wall, who you just heard from. We're also joined by Barra Blender of Communications Initiatives and Minerva Tirado from Strategic Sourcing and Contracts. And we'll all be speaking on this topic from different angles. And so we hope that it's helpful for you as you figure out what to do with vendors. So just a brief note about context regarding digital accessibility. A lot of you have heard me talk about this before, or one of us. But that just means that a website that that MIT hires a firm to develop meets the range of users, and that includes people with disabilities. So what that means is that people who are keyboard only users, people who might use screen reading to listen to the content, people who use voice recognition, people who need to zoom in to make everything larger, are all able to use the site effectively and interact with it. And the standard that is used in general and across organizations, government organizations, universities, businesses, is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, sometimes it's called, 2.1 AA. That is a standard put out by the World Wide Web Consortium, which is based here at MIT. And it's a standard that considers all of the needs of various kinds of users. So vendors should be familiar with this standard. At least we hope they are, and that they've educated themselves and they have a workflow in place to address it. One of the challenges regarding MIT websites, as you well know, is that every department has a different type of website. So there's no real standardization across MIT. There's no, general template for a departmental site. So everyone does things somewhat differently, and that does present challenges when working with vendors on website development. And we also want to remind you that accessibility is a continuum. It's not a check something off the list and it's all finished. Technologies change, platforms change, versions of web browsers change, and all of those contribute to the fact that you may have different results accessibility-wise in different points of a project.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. So as Kathy mentioned, there are a lot of challenges to digital accessibility. One of them is that it is really a continuous process. Accessibility is contextual, it depends on a lot of variables, and making something 100% accessible to everyone is not entirely possible, but we want to try to eliminate as many barriers as possible. The basics of accessibility are fairly simple and straightforward, but they can get complex pretty quickly. And I wanted to go through just a few of the other challenges that you might face in dealing with digital accessibility. So one is that design and development vendors have different levels of expertise and experience. And it's good to know where they fall on that continuum in terms of expertise and experience. We use a lot of different platforms. At MIT, Drupal and WordPress are very common. The platforms themselves are fairly accessible, but you can put content up there that in a way that makes it inaccessible. And so we want to help you avoid that. WordPress does have accessible themes. If you're not hiring an outside vendor and you're doing a WordPress site on your own, they do have accessible themes that you could choose from, and we would encourage you to do that. A number of groups on campus, particularly when budget is limited, use out-of-the-box web solutions like Wix or Weebly or Squarespace. You don't have a lot of control over those solutions. That's the point, that they just give you a website that's sort of ready to go and you put your content in. So, there can be some barriers there, but Wix does provide accessible templates. So if you're going to use a solution like that, we'd encourage you to pick an accessible template. Wix and Squarespace also provide a lot of information about how to make your site a little bit more accessible, how to make your content more accessible. And we would encourage you to take advantage of that and use that. Kathy mentioned the WCAG requirements. And those can be challenging. The high level guiding principles are pretty straightforward and easy to understand, but the detail and the success criteria that they use can be confusing. And that's where our group is really here to help you sort of weed through that and figure that out. Browsers and assistive technology. These are software applications, and software changes all the time. I feel like my Chrome browser updates almost daily. Firefox updates all the time. And I think you've probably seen it aside from digital accessibility, but websites, something stops working because the browser updated and it doesn't work well with the plugin that you're using or the platform that you're using. Assistive technologies like screen readers, like voice recognition, our software, they update, and sometimes we see a bug that appears after the software is updated. Something's not working. So these are all things that can be challenging in terms of digital accessibility. And we just want to let you know who's here from MIT to help you sort of weed through these challenges. So I'm going to turn this over to Bara now.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bara Blender from Communications Initiatives. We are part of the Institute Office of Communications. And I wanted to give an overview of how our office can work with you on website projects. So first off, we can see how your website fits in with your other communications. That could include everything from visual look and feel to messaging, and that applies to any print publications, your social media. We just help you look at everything holistically to make sure everything fits well together. We also provide guidance on brand strategy and adherence to MIT's graphic identity standards. And that means proper use of the MIT logo, either on its own or in partnership with your department name. We advise on alignment with institute level goals and messaging. So I'm sure you're all aware that diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's a big priority of MIT's currently. We can help you understand how to work that into your communications, be it inclusive language, photos to show that MIT is welcoming to women. We can help you think through all of those types of items. We can recommend creative vendors that match your scope and budget. We will also review the draft of your request for proposals, or we can help you write it if you'd prefer that. And once the proposals come in, we can review those with you. We can help you understand what you're reviewing to make sure you're comparing apples to apples. And we can also assess the web designs and content once the project gets underway. And here's our contact email at the bottom if you'd like us to help you with a web project. Next slide. So now I thought I'd review some of the highlights of a typical website process. And the final bullet here has a link that has a lot of great resources about how that process should ideally work and function. So of course, you're going to start off with planning for your project. This involves defining your audience and your key messages, thinking about your schedule. What about your content strategy? How often will the site need to be updated for content? Is it weekly? Is it monthly? And who's going to do those content updates? You also want to think about hosting and support. Most departments don't have an internal person who can manage the website on a dedicated server. So most websites at MIT are hosted externally with a service such as Pantheon. So you'll need to plan for this in your budget. And the vendors that you are working with or proposing on your project can give you some estimates on this item. Next is the request for proposals. This document will help vendors understand the scope of your project, which will enable them to provide some accurate pricing. Few things you'll want to make sure to include for sure. Who's on the project team and who's the daily contact? Who will be acting as the project manager? Who's your audience? And you can break that out into primary and secondary audiences. What are your goals and what are your desired features for the website? It may be content only or text only. You may have photos, videos, you can have interactive features. You may connect to a third-party backend database. So what types of features are you planning to include? It's really helpful to talk about what's working or not working on your current site. This can really provide a lot of good insights. You can look at your Google Analytics on this to see, hey, maybe there are some pages that people never go to. If that's the case, we shouldn't have those pages on the site. Think about what your preferred website platform is. Most people are using either WordPress or Drupal for their websites, but there are some other options out there, and you should consider what might work best for you. And know that there is a lot of support for Drupal and WordPress at MIT. And last but certainly not least, you'll want to include MIT's digital accessibility requirements. And Kathy will talk a bit about this in a bit more detail later on in the presentation. So once you've sent out the RFP and you have your proposals back, you'll want to review them and meet with any or all of the firms really to get a better sense of their process and to see if they're a good personality fit. You'll be working with them for many months. This is likely a big investment that you'll be making in a new website. So you do want to make sure that it's the right fit for you. When you get to design and development, it's important to involve disability and access services. They can review the design and the website code for compliance around color contrast, font size, and how well someone with a visual, physical, or cognitive disability can navigate your site. It's really important not to overlook this because we do need to be as inclusive as possible. So here's the final bullet again, has the link with a lot more guidance on this process. And now I'll turn it back to Kathy for more details about the RFP accessibility language.
Thanks, Bara. So the standard RFP that I believe both Bara's department and, if I'm not mistaken, Minerva's as well, contains some basic accessibility language included into it. And that is requiring a digital accessibility in the product, and that it conforms to those web content accessibility guidelines standards that I mentioned earlier. It also includes information about being able to deploy this, to test before they deploy, so that testing any website in development, that the web contractor has done their due diligence and that they have tested and evaluated their site for accessibility before they hand it over to you. And you want to make sure that there's documentation, the documentation is accessible, but also that the documentation includes some of the information about accessibility standards. You want to make sure that that it has this language because, as Catherine mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that the website will work across browsers, across operating systems, even across devices, especially if you're considering having it work on mobile as well. If there are any issues that the vendor is encountering with meeting the standard, they need to come back to the project team and inform you of that so you can figure out how to address it before you go live. And now I will turn it over to Catherine to talk about some of the questions to consider around components.
Thanks, Kathy. When, planning is such an important part of the process, as I think Bara laid out, and it's good to think about accessibility as well very early in the process. You want to think about, are there aspects of your project that may introduce barriers to accessibility. Some examples would be videos. Is your site going to be very video heavy? And so you need to think about what the workflow and process will be to get videos captioned. Will you have a lot of interactive elements on the site? Things like, for a while, timelines, interactive timelines were very common. That's typically a widget or plugin of some kind. Is what you're planning to use going to be accessible? What are the accessible versions of that are out there? Is your site going to have a lot of dynamic content that changes as the user interacts with it? That can represent a significant barrier to someone who can't see the screen. They need to know when the information has changed. If you're going to have forms on your site that a user would need to fill out and complete to sign up for something, to register for an event, you're going to want to make sure that those forms are accessible. If you're putting PDFs up on your site, you're going to want to think about that information. Do you really need it to be PDFs? And if they do need to be PDFs, will they be accessible? What is the workflow for that? How will you manage that? And accessibility may be a new concept to your team, and you want to really familiarize yourself with the basics. You don't need to be an accessibility expert, but it would be good to know some of the basics that need to be covered. And we can help you with some of that. We can refer you to basic training and basic information. It also means that you might want to choose a vendor with more accessibility expertise if this is new to you. And as Bara said, you're going to want to interview vendors, and she mentioned a lot of questions that you're going to want to ask the vendors. But there are also questions regarding accessibility that you want to ask. And you want to ask the vendors, what is your experience with accessibility? Have you produced websites for other organizations that follow accessibility standards, like the government, universities, disability-related organizations, healthcare organizations? It would be great to know what their previous experience has been. You want to know how they evaluate accessibility. Is this something that they're doing throughout the design and development process or only at the end? Are they using tools to assess accessibility? Are they using automated tools? Do they do any sort of manual checking? Are they checking for keyboard accessibility? Do they have any experience with screen reading technology? Are they familiar with it? Are they familiar with voice recognition? And you also want to know what their process is for addressing accessibility issues. How do they retest and reevaluate and make sure that those issues were addressed? You want to make sure that they're not just fixing a color contrast issue on one page, but that they're really looking at the whole palette to make sure that that issue isn't going to come up again. So now I'm going to turn it over to Minerva, who's going to talk a little bit about strategic sourcing and their role.
Hi, everyone. I'm Minerva. I'm from Strategic Sourcing and Contracts. Strategic Sourcing and Contracts negotiates agreements and discounts for goods and services for campus-wide use. We also work with departments to help them through the RFP process. We can facilitate, draft the RFP, or review your RFP and provide you with feedback. We also review vendors' bids and statements of work and negotiate contracts on your behalf. We also provide vendor recommendations, which include small, local, diverse businesses, and try to match you. We match you up with the right vendor for to meet your requirements. Next slide. In terms of contracts, the key takeaway here is that departments should not sign contracts. The contracts are typically forwarded to my office. Usually the department creates a requisition and attaches the contract, which then gets forwarded to one of the contract administrators to review and sign. Suppliers that are under contract at MIT are familiar with MIT's terms and conditions, which include accessibility guidelines, use of name, and ownership. It also includes the rates and pricing, and for projects for individual departments, the statement of work is also included in the contract. And to review some of the preferred vendors under contract, you can visit the site below. Next slide. Here is our contact information to reach out to us if you have a question or are working with the vendor and need some assistance. I would also encourage you that if you're working with a vendor who's never done work at MIT, to reach out to us sooner than later so that we can have a discussion with the vendor before you're trying to kick off a meeting. Back to accessibility.
Thanks, Minerva. So I want to talk a little bit about how you engage with the accessibility and user experience team. First and foremost, you want to contact us early in the project, typically after you've selected a vendor. You know, our services are free, but the cost sometimes of working with us is scheduling, because we are a small team. And we do have busy periods when everybody seems to be doing a web project. What we like to do is to schedule a 30-minute Zoom meeting to just introduce the project and get a sense of what services you're going to need from us. And then we can get you on our calendar, even if it's months out. And so we have a sense of what's coming. We do offer a variety of services, and I'm just going to talk about a couple and the time frames involved. I think Bara mentioned before that we offer design reviews, and that's where we can look at sort of the flat design files for visual accessibility, really the surface of the website. We'll provide you with a written report, and we'll look at things like color contrast, font size, content layout, and we can also highlight anything we see as sort of a red flag for accessibility that we think we might be an issue later on. The turnaround time for that is about a week, and as I said, we do provide a written report. Later on in the project, we can do an accessibility review of a working prototype. That's where we test with automated checkers, screen readers, we check for keyboard access. This is not a full-on accessibility audit, but it's really just a functional review of the web page and a few subpage, the home page and a few subpages, to make sure that we don't see any significant barriers and that it's meeting the standards. The way that we work with this review is that we list the issues in MIT's instance of GitHub. So we're providing you with an issues list. We found that this works pretty well because we can look at the list. You can ask questions. You know, our team can provide code snippets. We're very fortunate to have a developer on our team who can look at the code and sort of see what the problems might be and provide some suggestions for solutions. So the turnaround time for getting you the initial issues list is about a week, but we can spend some significant time going back and forth to fix and address issues. We also provide a wide range of user experience services, from card sorting to user testing. The time frame for that varies depending on the project and how involved it is. And we are always available to answer questions. So if you have a question related to accessibility, you're thinking about using a tool, you want to know how accessible it is, please send us an email. We're happy to answer your questions and to set up a quick Zoom if we need to talk through it or give a demonstration. Now, there are issues that come up. And this is sort of, there are accessibility issues. They can be complicated. They can at times be difficult to remediate. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the common issues that we see or the common misunderstandings. And the most important thing to remember is to get in touch with us and have a conversation. What we found really is that everyone wants to do the right thing. The project teams at MIT, department heads, they really want to make websites that are accessible. Vendors are trying to provide accessible websites, but sometimes getting there can be difficult. So we find it really helps for us to get together and talk through the issues, maybe demonstrate them, and we can figure out a solution. What we often see is we'll put issues into GitHub, and maybe you don't understand the issue. Maybe it's not clear. And if that's the case, we'd really love for you to reach out to us and we can explain it. We can even do a live demonstration via Zoom if that would clarify. Sometimes we even see issues that really can't be remediated. There are barriers that can't be eliminated. And an example of this would be during the sort of height of COVID, when we couldn't have in-person events, a number of departments were using virtual reality platforms to have events where people would have avatars and go to different rooms and socialize. We talked with vendors, we worked with the project teams, and there really wasn't a way to make that accessible to a screen reader user. And so we needed to talk about what accommodations would be necessary to make those events available and accessible to users with visual disabilities. Sometimes we also see, a vendor doesn't entirely understand an issue, and maybe they say, I can't duplicate it. This is an issue that you're calling out, but we don't see it. In that case, we find it saves a lot of time and aggravation to set up a Zoom meeting where we can get online and we can demonstrate the issue. And we can sort of try to sort things out there. So we would encourage you to do that. Let's see. And the last thing that I want to talk about is maintenance of your website. This might be new to many of you, but it's part of accessibility being a continuous process. As we said, things change in the background and in the foreground on websites all the time. And it's important to continually be thinking of accessibility and checking up on it. So it's good to have a process in place to check for accessibility periodically. I realize we could do a whole other presentation on this, but I just wanted to hit a couple of the ways that you could do this fairly easily. Doesn't mean you need to be an accessibility expert, but you could spot check the captions on your videos and the alt text on your images to make sure that the captioning flow is still working, that they're still up to date. Sometimes videos get taken down and reposted and it messes up the captions. It's great to know that if you're adding a lot of images to your site, that workflow is working, the folks adding those images are putting alt text on them so that those are available. You can stop using your mouse and just make sure that the site is available to keyboard only users. You want to make sure that the interactive elements are available, like links and buttons and form fields, using your tab key and the space bar and the enter key. You can also use an automated tool. There are some free ones like Wave and Andy to check a page and see if there are any accessibility errors. They only really find about 30 to 50% of errors, but it's a good spot check. And there is some training material available on our website about using those free tools. And we're happy to talk to you more about that. So here's a list of sort of the basic resources that we've mentioned, for accessibility and user experience. We have a lot of information available on our site about accessibility, tools you can use. Communications Initiative has a lot of good information about the web development process and how to go about that. And strategic sourcing, I can attest, has been incredibly helpful in working through some of these accessibility issues with vendors and trying to sort out, how we're going to get these things done. So this is the contact information for all of them. So that's about all we have. And now we'd like to move on to questions. If folks have questions, you can put them in the chat or raise your digital hand and we'll do our best to answer them.
I don't have any questions in the chat right now, Catherine. I don't know if there's any digital hands raised. I don't see that. Is anyone? Don't.
I don't see, anybody have questions? Did we
I don't see any
completely
questions.
overwhelm you or?
Oh, there's one in the chat now.
Oh, there
Oh.
is. Okay. Do you have any particular suggestions for working with existing vendors rather than starting from scratch with a new RFP? I'm not sure who wants to take that one, but
We
Well,
might,
I was going to say it depends on what you're trying to do. So it's not what your requirements are.
okay. We have a second question here. How do vendors get added to the preferred vendors list?
There's usually an RFP process to validate and benchmark pricing that goes out with to vendors, and they respond to it. For this area of designers and developers, the vendors are typically put under contract, and it's something that we're working towards because there is no set pricing, and individual statement of works are scoped out per the requirements of the project. So that's that. But in the preferred vendors in terms of photographers and design writers and closed captionings, when we are able to get discounted prices, they do get added to the preferred vendor list.
Okay. Okay.
I do want to get back to the previous question, Minerva. Should we
Sure.
talk a bit about the best practice of bidding out a project over a certain dollar amount? I know, Dan, you were asking about, can you stick with an existing vendor? I mean, if you have someone doing updates to a current site who developed your site, then yes, it would make sense. But if you have a new site and you are thinking, about bidding it out, that's where the RFP can be very helpful.
Yeah, and I actually don't believe in a threshold, even though MIT says that, anything over $10,000. If you're redesigning a website, you should get competitive bids because it is going to inform your budget and you're going to understand what's actually required and who the best vendor is for you. But if you have an ongoing relationship with a developer and a designer and they are providing you competitive bids and it is coming under $10,000 and you feel comfortable not getting a bid, then you're fine. But I just don't want to make a blank statement like that because it really depends on what you're trying to do and what's involved.
We have a couple more. Molly asks, this may be on your website, but what makes a PDF accessible? Oh, Catherine, I'll let you take that one.
so that's an excellent question. And the quick answer is if it has structure, basically a PDF was originally an image of a document. So it was like a picture, which made it inaccessible. Now PDFs have structure to them similar to websites, but not as extensive. It's called tagging. So you want to make sure that the structure comes through on the PDF so that someone knows where the headings are, they know where the lists are, they can read the tables, and that the images have an alternative description and things like that. So it's basically almost tagging it like a website so that it's available to someone using a screen reader. And it's fairly complicated to do. And I think Margaret does have extensive experience with this, as do our friends in HR, making a lot of PDFs accessible and working with outside vendors to do that.
Well, actually, Catherine, very good as a follow-up, Margaret had just posted right after that, and I didn't want to interrupt you. She stated, we recently worked on an accessible PDF project and had a great experience with a vendor who specialized in remediating PDFs to assure they're accessible. Do we refer them to VPF so that they can figure out if they are on the preferred vendor list? We have solicited quotes from many more than 3 vendors.
I'm familiar with the list, Margaret.
Oh.
Because we have back and forth conversations, and that's one area that we can look to add vendors to help with PDF remediation. It was a conversation that I had with accessibility early on, but other priorities took place with trying to finish up closed captioning vendors. So definitely.
Okay. Does anyone else have questions in the chat? I don't see any hands raised currently. Anyone else?